Okay, everyone, thank you so much for being here. It is my pleasure to introduce Luke Rogers for his thesis defense. So Luke came to us from Alaska. I think we had a really hard time. In fact, I know we had a really hard time convincing him to come to Nebraska from Alaska. But ultimately, the allure of studying bison, which is a creature that is very near and dear to Luke's heart, was enough to convince him to come down from the wilds of Alaska to the cornfields of Nebraska, the other Aska, as I refer to it. And I'm really excited today for him to present his thesis research. Luke has worked incredibly hard over the last 2+ years on understanding the status and ecological recovery of North American bison. This is something that he's extremely passionate about, and I'm incredibly proud of the work that he's put into it. And just very, very proud of him and glad to be able to call him a friend and a colleague. So with that, I will introduce Luke and let him take it away.
Right there. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so happy to be here today. It's been a long journey. I'm sure most of you know me already, but for those that don't, my name is Luke Rollie Rogers. I'm a graduate student here in the biology department. And the thesis I will be defending for you today that I've been working on the last 2 years is titled "The Status and Ecological Recovery of North American Bison." So with that, let's get right into it then. Maybe. There you go. That's all. Before I start talking though about my research, I just wanted to have some acknowledgements for the people that have helped me get to where I'm at now today. First of all, my committee members. Dr. Dustin Ranglack is my advisor, and he's been a great bison buddy to have and talk about bison these last couple of years. Dr. Glenn Plum, also very smart and great individual to work with. And my other two committee members, Dr. Wilner and Dr. Bice, have been very helpful where I needed them here to make me move forward with my project. The World Wildlife Fund was the major funding agency for this research. In particular, I worked with Dennis Jorgensen and Noel Guernsey. I'm very grateful for them being able to help me with this and fund this project. Additionally, the National Bison Association is, and their leadership, Jim Matheson, Ken Clem, and Dave Carter, were extremely important in being able to get research done through their organization, and they helped facilitate sending out my research data to them. So I'm very grateful for that. And last but not least, I wouldn't be where I am today without all of the friends and family that I have, and they've just helped me get past this. We've had a great amount of fun these last couple of years working together. We've helped each other out a lot, and I owe a lot of this to them. So thank you all that are here with me today or are on Zoom. I just appreciate it so much. So also I'll give you a quick roadmap of what I'll be talking about today for you. First of all, I'll give you an introduction on the topic and what is all going on in the bison world today. Then we'll go into my first content chapter, which is getting a status of North American bison. After that, my second content chapter is the ecological recovery of North American bison. And finally, I'll wrap that up with some conclusions and future directions for us. So first of all, an introduction. I'm not sure how much you guys know about bison historically, so I'll start everyone off on even footing here. Bison once roamed North America in the tens of millions. And a quote I like to think about is Lewis and Clark on their expansion west. They mentioned experiencing a sea of bison around them that stretched as far as they could see across the horizon. They had an expansive range here in red, which went from east to west coast, down south into northern Mexico, and all the way up north to Alaska, where I'm from. Now, despite this prolific abundance and distribution all across North America, the expansion of the West brought with it the eradication of the bison. and eventually the complete and total collapse, almost near extinction. It's unfortunate that we went from so many tens of millions to less than 1,000 at one point. But yet there was a few individuals that recognized this and they wanted to reverse this long before anything like the 1950s environmental movement occurred. The bison were the original conservation species. And because of that, today, we know that bison aren't extinct. And probably most of us here have seen a bison somewhere. There is several 100,000 bison in existence today, and we know that from general knowledge. What we don't know, though, is we don't know the exact population of it. We know it's hundreds of thousands, but is that 100,000? Is that 900,000? Is it somewhere in the middle? There's a lot of wide-ranging estimates for that, but there's no clear idea. However, this isn't really such a big deal outside of North America. I don't know if you knew this, but there is such thing as the European bison, the cousin to our North American bison. They are very well documented, and most recently they came out with a number of 8,927 individuals in 421 herds. Similarly, North American bison outside of North America, held in zoos and some meat commercial herds, there's very good documentation on those as well. And we know that there's around 1,600 bison in 180-ish herds. So numbers aren't the only thing that matters though, right? We also really don't understand the management situations that these bison exist within. However, we assume that there are some very major management differences. And those management differences are leading some bison towards domestication and some bison towards the path of staying wild. And what those assumptions are doing is they're excluding some bison from conservation assessments. Those are perceived to not have conservation value or not as much conservation value. But really there's no information that shows directly that these management assumptions are even true, the differences. So there's a large lack of information there. But what do they even mean when they're talking about domestication? Well, let's use, for example, the auroch, which is the modern, the ancestor of the modern cow. So through thousands of years of domestication, what happened was they did non-natural sex ratios. So manipulating the sex ratio. They removed mate competition. They removed sexual selection. And they didn't remove sexual selection, but they started to have sexual selection. They chose individuals to breed and they removed individuals through culling based on specific characteristics. Basically, they removed natural selection pressures in the end, or they changed them to something different from a wild natural selection pressure and used things like supplemental feeding to do so and to have them become domestic species. These weren't always intentional, and for bison, it certainly is not always the intention of the manager, but these can be inadvertent side effects that have a ripple effect throughout generations that may lead towards domestication. And so this is important because we have these different assessments that assess the conservation of the species, and there's international versions of it. For example, the biggest organization that does that is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. They're world-renowned and they work on conservation projects all throughout the world. One thing that they have done to try to avoid having bison count in their assessments that are trending more towards this domestication side, because they're only trying to conserve wild bison, is they've set these criteria, the IUCN wildness criteria, we can call them. What are these wildness criteria? The first one is that the bison herd exists on a range size greater than 5,000 hectares. Also that there's no fences surrounding the range of the bison herd. That they have a population size greater than 1,000 individuals, which is a minimal viable population for genetic integrity. That they have a natural sex ratio between 1:1 and 1:5, male to females. That they have measured genetic variation, no cattle gene integration, no reproductive selection, no supplemental feeding, large carnivores present on the range, and documented long-term protection. So many of these criteria are valuable, and they do help address that idea of trending towards domestication or trending towards staying wild. But in order for a bison to be considered wild by the IUCN, they need to meet every single one of these criteria, which leads to a binary system. And what I mean by that, this is for the assessment criteria by the IUCN. We see that you either have one of two options, that is, sorry. You can either be not managed as wildlife or managed as wildlife. You either hit every single criteria or you miss one and you're automatically in the not managed as wildlife. When reality shows that this isn't really the case. We have a continuum of bison management situations. And it's not based off of 10 criteria that they either hit or don't hit. It's really based off of the scale, so the population size and the range size and the management intensity of the herd. And so most bison don't exist on one end or the other. They exist somewhere in that gray area in the middle, which the binary system is not really catching, but this continuous system is. And why does this matter? Well, I had talked about exclusion. Some bison don't count, apparently, according to the IUCN criteria. And what that leads to is an underrepresentation of their conservation status. This is the output from the most recent Red List assessment, which is essentially the endangered species list for the entire world of all species, not just in the United States like we have here. So most recently, bison were deemed near threatened, which is one step away from vulnerable and in that level of risk of extinction. So that is despite the fact that we know there's hundreds of thousands of bison. So we would expect, based off of just knowing the numerical abundance, that there'd be a lot more, that this would be at a higher level than it is. But because so many are excluded, over 90% of bison that exist are not included in this assessment. It's at this level. You know, this might be another extra problematic situation when we get to a new assessment that they've developed, which is the green status assessment. If we use this binary criteria for it, we may also risk underrepresenting the green status assessment. And just so you know what the green status assessment is, I'll touch more on it later. Instead of being what is the extinction risk at this time, which is what the Red List assessment does, it measures the ecological recovery over time of the species and it projects into the future. So it's capturing not only their extinction risk, but what is their ecological recovery in the environment. So we have two objectives of this research in order to address these issues that we've mentioned in our introduction here. The first objective is to update the status of North American bison and do so by management sector, the various ones that they have. Not only just the numerical status of them, but also the management status. Our second objective is to quantify the ecological recovery using this novel IUCN Green Status Assessment tool. And we're going to accomplish both of these objectives with this idea of wildness in mind. And how does it influence this? So with that, let's go into our first one, the status of North American bison. We wanted to get a new population estimate for the global population. So to do that, we pooled together various sources from national and international groups, such as the USDA, the Intertribal Buffalo Council, the previous Red List assessment, and others. And that is how we got a population estimate. But we wanted more than just a population estimate. So we went further and we surveyed the bison. This is a sticker that my sister had created for my survey. So in our survey, this was only for the North American population. We asked 53 questions. These included things like the location, the population, how they're managed, which management sector they're in, whether it's a federal, state, provincial, nonprofit, tribal, private, or a zoo herd. Other things like diseases and genetics. And we did all of this from January to September of 2020. Additionally, Mexico, the Mexican Bison Working Group, took this survey and translated it to Spanish, and they directly contacted every bison manager in Mexico, which is the first time that's ever been done, which is really cool. Here's an example of what one of the survey questions was. They had an option to either write in their own number for the population size of the herd, or they could have chose one of these bounds, or unknown, or I prefer not to answer. I'm showing you this one because we used this question to determine what our minimum count was. And by doing that, we just added together the numbers that they entered, if they entered in a precise number, or we took the lower bound of whichever one of these groups they chose. So for example, if they chose 11 to 50 individuals in the herd, we took the lower bound of that as 11. So they have at least 11 bison. To statistically analyze this data and understand what's going on, we did the Fisher exact test, which was for each of those wildness criteria that I presented to you before. We figured the proportional differences between management sectors using this Fisher exact test. But we wanted more than just for each criteria, how did they differ? We wanted to get more of a full holistic picture of how these bison are being managed. So for that, we used the multiple correspondence analyses, which mapped all the bison herds based on their general rather than specific adherence to those wild criteria. And lastly, we wanted to group herds together from that MCA, multiple correspondence analysis, regardless of their management sector. And we did that based on similarities using this hierarchical clustering method. So those were our statistical tests. Now let's talk about the results we got from that. Well, first of all, you probably want to know what we think the global bison population is. Based off of all the data we combined together, we estimate that the global bison population is between 350 and 400,000 bison, and those exist within about 3,000 herds. So that is the estimate of our current bison population globally. We surveyed a subset of that population. We didn't get every single person to participate in our survey. That'd be really hard to do, but we did the best we could, and these are the herds that we did survey. In green here, with red being the historical range that I showed you before. And as I mentioned before, if you look down towards Mexico at the bottom there, that is the first time that we've ever completed a census for the Mexican bison. So that's new data that has never been shown before. We wanted to talk about the wildness criteria and how it changes by management sector. So to do that on a specific level, we did that Fisher exact test. And these are the results of that. This looks like a ton of information. You probably can't read it that well from here. So let's break it down a little bit more. First of all, we have our different management sectors at the top, and on their side are our different criteria. This first one I have highlighted for you here is our total minimum count and the total number of herds surveyed for each management sector, with the total circled at the end here. So we surveyed at least 100,000 bison and 360 herds, which would be about 25% of the global bison population and about 10% of all of the bison herds. So that's pretty good for a survey. Looking into some of these specific wildness criteria, if we talk first about the range size being greater than 5,000 hectares, and also I should describe here what this is showing. So that percentage there is showing the percent of respondents in that sector that meet that criteria. So for example, the circled one there is 64%. So 64% of the surveyed state and provincial herds meet this criteria. There's also a letter next to each of those, and those indicate significant differences from our Fisher exact test. So if they have the same letter, for example, these two circled both have a B, that means they're not significantly different from one another. But the other three management sectors each have an A, which means they are significantly different from our test. So to go back to this, state and provincial and federal herds had significantly greater proportion of herds on 5,000 plus acres. When it comes to fencing, state provincial herds had significantly greater proportion with no fencing than the other management sectors. When it comes to male-female sex ratio, we see that the private sector had significantly lower proportion of herds with natural sex ratios than the other sectors. When it comes to whether a genetic test has been conducted, the nonprofit, state, provincial, and federal herds all had significantly greater proportion with genetic testing conducted. And then lastly for this one, when it comes to supplementation, whether that's food or minerals, we see that nonprofit, state, provincial, and federal management sectors had a greater proportion of herds that were not being supplementally fed than the zoo or private sectors. So those were our big results from the Fisher exact test when it comes to the IUCN wildness criteria. There's a couple other unique results that don't pertain to that, but I just wanted to share with you here as well. So the first one is that when it comes to carcass decomposition, we see that nonprofit, state, provincial, and federal management sectors have a greater proportion of herds that are allowing the carcass to decompose on site. When it comes to whether large carnivores are on the range or not, we see that the state and provincial herds have significantly greater proportion with large predators present. And then when we start talking about the use of these herds, what are they being used for? When it comes to culture, specifically indigenous culture and including that, the federal herds have a greater proportion that are being used for that. And these are self-assessments from the managers, I should mention. This is what they believe the herd is being used for. When it comes to tourism and education and outreach, we see that the federal and zoo sectors really champion this and have a greater proportion of herds with this use. When it comes to meat production, we see that the private sector, by and far away from the other ones, is using their herds for meat production. And then when it comes to hunting, lastly, we see that state provincial has a significantly greater proportion of herds that are being used for hunting. However, one thing that I found that was not a significant difference between each of these management sectors is the belief that their herds are being used for bison conservation. I'll come back to that in a little bit here. So that was the Fisher exact test results, which shows us for each one of those wildness criteria, are there proportional differences between the management sectors? But like I said before, we wanted a more general idea as well. So we used the multiple correspondence analysis for that. Here's what that looks like. Each dot that you see on here is a different bison herd. The colors that you see are the different management sectors that that bison herd exists within. When you see two dots are closer together, then that means that those herds are managed more similarly. And if they're far apart, then they're managed more differently from one another. The x-axis and the y-axis here are basically combinations of all of that wildness criteria, which can be a little bit confusing to understand. So let's break it down and make it a little bit easier. This x-axis is what is really showing us is the scale of the bison herd. So the population size and the range size that it's on, from small to large. The y-axis, what our MCA is really showing us is the management intensity, from less management intensity to more management intensity. So this makes it a little bit easier to digest and understand. Let's add one more bit of information on here. Now we have these circles and another dot in the middle. This is basically that average value for the demographic, or the management sector, I should say. So the circle is the confidence interval around it, and the point is where they believe that that would be. So we see that there is no significant difference with the federal sector average and the nonprofit and state provincial sectors, but every other sector is significantly different because they do not have overlapping circles, if that makes sense. So remember we talked earlier about, instead of it being a binary system, we have a continuum is the reality of the bison situation. And that continuum is based on management intensity and scale. Well, you might have already seen it. There is a bit of a trend line here forming. And you can somewhat see pretty clearly that that scale is right there, the continuum of bison. So one other thing I want to show you guys now, I'm going to change and add one more bit of information here to show you the cluster analysis. The colors are all the same. Now all I've done is I've changed the shape. Instead of them all being circles, now we have triangles for one cluster, which is similar bison herds, squares for another cluster, and circles for another. So the shape means the cluster of similarity that they're within. So this first cluster that we get, which is all the circles, is our small scale cluster. This other circle with all the triangles in it, this is our medium scale cluster. And then lastly, this circle here would be what we would consider our large scale cluster. And these would be the ones in this large scale cluster that would be generally the closest to adhering to that wildness criteria that we talked about. You know, bison herds in this cluster, they might not meet every single wildness criteria, but overall, they meet enough of them to be all grouped together. And one point I'd like to make here is that we see every single sector in every single cluster. So that might add some information when they make the assumption that some herds and some management sectors should be excluded and others included, when really we see here that kind of in every management sector, there are some herds that are on both ends of the spectrum of that continuum. So it adds a little bit of a refutation to that assumption that was made up before. Okay, so let's discuss these results here. Our objective was to update the status of North American bison by management sector. We asked, are there management differences among sectors? Is that assumption true? Yes, it is true. Our research shows that there are significant differences between these different management sectors. We then asked, is complete exclusion based on these differences, is it warranted? No, it's not warranted. Our multiple correspondence analysis shows that there are some herds in every management sector that are really trying their best to meet those wildness criteria and contribute to conservation. All of them are, of course, but some of them are just more on the wildness spectrum. And that leads us into now our ecological recovery of North American bison based off of this information. And if you remember, I had talked about this green status of species. This has never been done before on bison. It's a new tool. It assesses the ecological recovery over time instead of the extinction risk at this moment, like the red list assessment does. So going into the methods of the green status assessment, the first thing you need to do is you need to have spatial units on which to assess. So the red outline here, again, is that original range that I've shown you twice now. What we did was we broke it up into different spatial units. And for those, we used ecoregions because they're meaningful ecological boundaries that span a wide range, which bison exhibit. One thing I should note is that only herds that are within this original range can be used for the assessment. Though there are many bison herds that have potentially large conservation value outside of this range, just for the purpose of the assessment, we are only including the ones that are within the original range. What we came up with at the end was 23 spatial units. So for each of these spatial units, for example, we have the Northern Great Plains here. You assess it as one of four states. The score of 0 is absent, meaning there's no bison, no individuals at all present in that ecoregion. If you get present, that will give you a score of 3, which the only stipulation for that is that there are individuals present in that ecoregion or spatial unit. In addition to being present, if you are viable, meaning that you have a large, stable, genetically robust, sustainable, and replicated herds within that spatial unit, then it is considered viable, and you get a score of 6. And lastly, in addition to being viable, if you are functional, and throughout that spatial unit, all 4 main ecological functions of bison are being observed at an appropriate density, then you get a score of 9. What are these ecological functions that we're talking about? Well, the first one is heterogeneous grazing. You see here that some grass is long, some grass is short. When bison go through an area, they intensely graze one area and they won't graze other areas, which creates this heterogeneity in the landscape. Another way you get heterogeneity in the landscape is through wallowing. Bison are known to do this, and they create wallow pits. And those create edge habitat, which new primary succession species can grow on the sides of. Bison are also a really important prey species. And so that is one of their main ecological functions, is being available as a prey species. And lastly, when they are predated or when they die of old age, a bison carcass decomposes on site, and that creates a ton of nutrients in that small area that you wouldn't get otherwise with bison not being there. So we know now our spatial units, how to assess the recovery score, but we need to do it at multiple different time states. The first one being the former, which is at 1950, as defined by IUCN. After that, we do it at the current time state, which is now, and also a counterfactual scenario of that, which if there was no past conservation efforts, where would we be right now? We also do that for 10 years from now, and the counterfactual as well. If there was no continued bison conservation, where would we be at? And then lastly, we make a long-term aspirational goal of that, and where could bison be in the next 100 years? So these are the different time states that we assess the ecological recovery scores for. And to get that green score at each of these time states, what we do is we sum the assessed weights. So the sum of those different absent, present, viable, functional for each spatial unit. And we divide that by if every single spatial unit was functional. So you get a score of 0 to 100, 0 being extinct, and 100% being fully ecologically recovered. So we did this to get the output of the assessment. But we didn't just do one assessment. We did 3 assessments, and we called those iterations. So let's talk about the first iteration here. The first iteration we defined by using some of these wildness criteria, but we didn't survey every single wildness criteria in here. We didn't get legal protection information or cattle gene integration information on a reliable level. So we automatically removed those. So our first iteration here then is everything that remains. And these are the closest we can get to our official wild IUCN bison herds, which are 22 bison herds marked in yellow and roughly 19,000 individuals. For our second iteration, which include these bison and more, we changed that criteria even more. We removed most of them, and we left all that really mattered was the management intensity and the management of the genetics. And we removed all of that scale information. We don't care as much for the second iteration, whether they're on a large range size or have a large population size, but we do care about how they're managing the sex ratio, the reproductive selection, and the supplemental feeding. So for our second iteration, in addition to these yellow dots, which are second iteration herds, we also have all of these teal dots. And these are our wild with small scale bison, which is 53 bison total, or 53 herds total, and roughly 30,000 individuals. And then lastly, for our third iteration, it didn't matter what kind of management they had. All that mattered is that they had bison. So any single bison herd that we had survey information for and a location for, we included in this one. And so we ended up here. All the purple dots are our new added third iteration bison. And that totals 243 herds at 60,000 individuals. So now we have all the methods we needed in order to obtain our results. We plugged in that information for each of those iterations, and then we got our different green scores. Let's see what those look like here. So this is a figure of those different time states on the x-axis that I had presented before, and then the species recovery score is on the y-axis, going from 0 up to 100%. We have our iterations colored from light to dark. So the first iteration is the lightest. And so this is a map of the species recovery throughout time and what we predict it to be. So first of all, let's look at the former here. It's all the same for all of these different iterations. We held that constant because we didn't have a lot of information for 1950. So we used what we had available for that, and we held that constant throughout them. Also, the counterfactual scenario for today, if there was no bison conservation, and the same for the future. Those are all held constant as well, because bison are entirely dependent upon conservation actions to exist. If we didn't have continued conservation, they would most likely become extinct or very close to extinct. Unsurprisingly, when we add more bison though, to get our green scores, we get a higher green score. You add more bison, there's more viable, there's more present spatial units. So you get a higher green score. The same goes for the future 10 years from now. You get a higher green score. But the point I want to make up here is that in the long term, 100 years, there is a limit to this idea of adding more bison equals a greater ecological recovery. And adding any bison creates an ecological recovery that's greater. What we have happen here, and you can see by our second iteration that it's about the same as the third, but it even reaches a little bit higher as far as overall ecological recovery potential, is that you may have greater numerical recovery if every single bison counts, but it may come at the consequence of ecological recovery and management as wildlife. So this is just another way of representing that same information. Instead of it being a time state on the x-axis now, it is now a conservation metric, which is basically just a combination of the other ones from the last graph that I showed you. And the y-axis now is a change in recovery score instead of the actual recovery score. And I'll just make 2 quick points here. One is that in the short term, if we're looking for conservation gain of the species, there really is not a difference no matter what bison you count. There's going to be about the same amount of gain in the next 10 years. The next point I want to make is again here, and you can see it even more clearly, that in the very long term, there's not going to be a huge difference in the ecological recovery if you're counting bison by every single wildness criteria or no wildness criteria. But you do have that potential to reach a higher recovery if you use a second iteration idea, which would give you a little bit lower numerical recovery, but a much greater ecological recovery. Maybe not much greater, but a greater ecological recovery, I should say. Let's discuss these as well now. So our objective for this chapter was to quantify ecological recovery with this novel IUCN Green Status Assessment tool. We asked, will ecological recovery scores increase when more bison are included? Yes, they will. We will get that as we would expect. We then asked, will our ecological recovery scores be greatest when every single bison is included? Well, not necessarily. You do come into this issue of numerical recovery comes at the cost of ecological recovery sometimes, depending on how you consider the bison. So that is the conclusion of that content chapter. We've gone through a lot of information, I know, so let's recap some of that together here now and go into our conclusions and future directions. The first thing I kind of want to do is give a bit of a summary for each of these management sectors and show what my data shows you on how they're being managed. So first, we have the public sector, which is a combination of state, provincial, and federal herds. Our data shows that they have generally the largest populations and largest range sizes, and they have the least intensive management practices. They're very valuable for education and outreach uses, and also specifically at the state level for hunting opportunities. One of the issues or weaknesses potentially though of the public sector is that it's difficult to expand on. You know, there is limited public lands and there's not likely a whole lot of opportunity to expand that. So there is limitations on how this can expand in the future. Let's talk about the nonprofit sector. That's our Nature Conservancy, our American Prairie Reserve, National Wildlife Foundation, and even our local bison herd here at the Crane Trust. I consider these guys the middleman. That is because they have the greatest variation and they don't really sit on one end of the continuum or the other. They're kind of right there as far as an average in the middle of that gray spectrum. Though we do have some herds that are on both ends, like the American Prairie Reserve is one of the larger herds today. For the private sector, which is our National Bison Association, our Canadian Bison Association, our Ted Turner ranches, that's where the majority of bison are. 95% of the bison that exist are in this management sector. So they are by far the ones that are championing the numerical abundance of the species. And those bison have established a multi-million-dollar bison industry, which is based around the production of meat. And because of the private sector, basically anyone in the United States and probably even Canada can go to their local grocery store and buy something like this, buy some bison patties and have access to bison meat on a regular basis. With the Conservation Management Plan, the CMP, that was recently introduced by the National Bison Association, they're really trying to take those steps towards encouraging producers to treat the animals as wildlife and manage them. They should really continue to encourage genetic stewardship as they are, and hopefully actively discourage domestication processes such as more rump, less hump management, which essentially means a bigger stake size and more easy to manage, which is in essence saying they intend to domesticate them. So hopefully that will be discouraged in order to maintain the wild characteristic of the bison. For the zoo sector, there's many zoos that have bison. And they are great at having education and outreach, as well as tourism opportunities, which allows people to experience bison, even when they're very far away from where a natural bison herd would be. And that's certainly something that should be championed and appreciated about them. They also have very good documentation of their herds, which most other management sectors do not. Obviously, the zoo sector is going to be very small scale, very intensively managed. We recognize that maybe they're not being managed as wildlife in the best sense, but they have these other benefits, and that's not really their intention. So it's a cost benefit of that, but they do have a lot of value. And lastly, the tribal sector. Unfortunately, we didn't get a lot of response from the tribal sector in our research, and we recognize that, and that's okay. Obviously, the majority of this took place during the COVID-19 pandemic, so it was hard to get research data anyways. But there's a lot of opportunity for future research with this organization and hopefully get some of this information that we weren't able to collect. We all should know, at least, that the tribal sector really has the strongest connection culturally to bison. They lived with bison for hundreds, if not thousands of years before any Westerners came over. So they have a very strong cultural connection that should be encouraged. And they also potentially have the greatest opportunity for expansion. There's a lot of tribal land and a lot of interest in establishing bison herds on these native lands. So that's also a really good positive thing for them. And there's just so many tribal groups that are already involved in this process, and I'm sure there will be even more in the coming years. So those were some of the strengths and maybe some of the minor weaknesses of each of these management herds and how they differ between one another. One thing I just want to bring up again that they don't differ from is their belief that they are contributing to bison conservation in their own way. These may be different ways, but they're each doing something, and their goal is to contribute towards bison conservation. So knowing this information, how do we move forward with bison conservation in a way that includes each of these management sectors and maybe plays to their strengths and limits their weakness? What I want to talk about for just a brief minute here at the end of my discussion is shared stewardship. So what is shared stewardship? Well, I'll paint an example for you here. Here we have a bison, a tribal bison, on tribal land that's next to a national park, but separated by a fence. And I use tribal and national park, but this could be any of those different management sectors. You could change anything out here. It could be a nonprofit bison trying to go to private land, or it could be a state provincial bison trying to go to tribal land, any of these different combinations. One way that you could have shared stewardship is to take down that fence and allow that bison, that is a tribal bison, cross over into national park land, cross back over to tribal land. But you're creating a bigger landscape for those bison to work and collaboration among these different management sectors in order for bison conservation to flourish. This isn't actually a new concept. This is something that's happening right now quite a bit. In fact, there's the Buffalo Treaty, which I was able to sign with Amanda Medeiros at the National Bison Association conference 2 years ago. And there's members from every different management sector that signed that, all with the same goal of wanting to move forward with bison conservation. The US Department of Interior recently set out the Bison Conservation Initiative, which is explicitly seeking this cross-jurisdictional relationships in order to improve bison situations. The initiative with the Blackfoot Confederacy is one of these collaborations in which the Blackfeet Nation in Montana is collaborating with Waterton Lakes National Park in Canada and Glacier National Park in Montana to establish a bison herd. The World Wildlife Fund is helping with the DOI to make the Rosebud Sioux tribe potentially have one of the largest tribal bison populations ever, over 1,500 individuals in the next coming years, which is really exciting. The Nature Conservancy helps with Wind Cave National Park to establish a metapopulational structure of bison herds, because Wind Cave is too small to have a massive bison population. But if they moved a couple bison to each of these different TNC herds, you can still have a huge herd, but just in different locations in a metapopulation structure. And then lastly, the American Prairie Reserve is attempting to manage large bison herds on both public and private lands, as well as the IUCN is now including different experts in bison from every one of these management sectors instead of only the traditionally included ones. So they're all making strides towards this shared stewardship. So to conclude everything I've talked with you about today and give you a take-home message. First of all, we asked, were there management differences among sectors? Yes, we found those management differences. We then asked, was complete exclusion based off of these different management, based off of these management differences, is that warranted? No, not necessarily. Is ecological recovery scores, are they increasing when we include more bison from these different management sectors? Yes, we do get that increase. However, is ecological recovery greatest when every single bison is included? Well, there's a limit to that, and we need to consider that limit. And lastly, if we're trying to move forward, what is the best path? Is it shared stewardship? Is it one of the best options towards greatest ecological recovery? I advocate yes, I believe so. So I hope with this information that I've shared you, that we have improved our current understanding of bison conservation in North America, and that together we can all work together across the various management sectors to help restore our national mammal. Thank you. All right, so I still have some time for questions. What are we looking at here? It is 3:18, so I have about 12 minutes for questions. And I will open up the chat as well. If anyone wants to drop one in the chat, I can answer your questions. So feel free, if you have one, to let me know. Hi, Letty, what's up?
Hey, Luke, nice talk.
Thank you.
I had a question about, so you had that, when you were looking at the first iteration and you had all those eco regions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will. The first iteration.
The yellow dots.
There you go.
There.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so what I was wondering is, have they, and maybe you said this and I missed it. With that first iteration, are those individuals also genetically similar? Do they know that?
There is some genetic similarities, but that's not the main focus of it. It's not a reason why they're in this iteration,
Sure.
but there certainly is some genetic linkage. And bison historically, as I mentioned, had a massive bottleneck where they
Right,
reduced
they
down
did,
to less than
right,
1,000.
yeah.
So there's some genetic linkage between all
Mhm.
bison at this point. But
Yeah, and I don't know, has there also been, and this is outside of what your research project, but has there been sort of historical investigation of the genetics within the bison herds where, the reason I'm asking is because those two populations to me look like they could have been, a refugia and then expanded back into that area.
gotcha.
Like from the last ice sheets. And so I was just wondering if that was any, if it just happens to be because of how you were organizing them.
Yeah, so
Or if they were related in some way.
I got you. There certainly is. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Dustin. So Letty asked if there was some sort of genetic linkage between these different bison herds, and that was part of the reason why they were included in this first iteration. And that is not a criteria for wildness, but there certainly is some genetic linkage, and a lot of bison herds today are being established from a source population, such as Yellowstone, such as Teddy Roosevelt, or other ones, or Wood Buffalo National Park. So a lot of these other herds are linked to those, but that's not a specific criteria.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think I have some questions in the chat here I'll look at real quick. So Lee Jones asks, how were the 4 ecological functions of bison identified? patch grazing, wallowing, predation, and carcass decomposition. Yeah, so in our survey that we sent out, there was a question that asked, which of these ecological functions have you observed on the range? So it had nothing to do with the level they had been observed or anything of that sort. It was just had they been observed. So in order for us to identify whether the herd had these, it was basically just if the manager had reported that. And there was no information on the density of it, which perhaps in the future would be a good way to, or a good area to maybe work on a little bit more and improve and see kind of that density dependency on it. But we just basically use the presence, absence, and then the other information on the herd size and range size to determine their ecological functionality. Is there any in the audience here? Otherwise, I'll read another one from the chat. Okay, Rurik Liss asks, oh, that wasn't a question. Another one is, what percentage of herds were subjected to predation, and did you include humans in that predation? That's a great question. We did ask if they had predation and whether it was non-human or human predation. So there was two options so that there's no confusion between the predation for by humans or by other predators. And it asked what percentage of those were subjected to it. Let's see. I don't know if I have that with me right here or not. But I can get back to you for that. If you want to drop your email in the chat, Peter and Kathy, I can send you some information on that later, just to get that to you. Yeah. Okay, next question we have here is from Dennis Jorgensen. And he says, it seems that scale, population, and landscape, as well as management intensity were key criteria on the spectrum that you generated. Does that suggest that maximizing scale and reducing management intensity are likely to be key factors in supporting ecological recovery? That's a good question. I think that when you maximize scale and you have a large bison herd on a large range, you're just naturally going to reduce that. You can't manage them as intensely because it's too big of an area, too many bison to manage. So what you're going to naturally do is reduce that management intensity so they're linked with one another. Are those likely factors in supporting ecological recovery? Yes, I believe so, because when you're managing them less intensely, you're not providing supplemental forage. Maybe you're not picking up every animal that dies on the landscape. So these natural ecological functions are starting to show up just naturally by that management intensity and scale change. Yes, Dustin.
So follow-up question to that.
Sure.
Given that in our modern landscape, large scale areas for reintroduction are very limited to non-existent, are there ways that we can still achieve ecological recovery on smaller scale landscapes? What type of tools could we use to do that?
Sure, yeah. And I think,
Repeat the question.
yeah, thank you, Dustin. My advisor, Dustin, asked, there is not a lot of opportunity for really large scale bison herd in ranges these days. So is it possible to get this ecological recovery at a smaller scale? And what are those kind of tools? So that's kind of one of the main things I show in my second iteration of the green status assessment. We removed all of that scale information. Let me just pull it up for you here again so you can see. We removed all those requirements of scale, and it only became part of how they're being managed, and specifically their genetics. So in my opinion, the tools that we need in order to have ecologically meaningful herds at these smaller scales is to, one, make sure that it's still at an appropriate density on the landscape. that we are minimizing or hopefully removing any supplementation of food or mineral resources, that the landscape is still large enough to support a bison herd, whether that's a herd of maybe 50 animals or 200 animals instead of thousands of animals, but that we make sure that that is the right density for it on the landscape. Other options to maybe improve the ecological recovery on small scale would be to create some sort of way for the large carnivores to cross through the range. That way that they have that as an ecological function that's happening. Yeah, I'd say those are some of the things off the top of my head I can think of. I'm sure if I had more time to sit down, I can think of several more. I'm going to ask a question or answer a question from the chat real quick, and then I'll get to you, Amanda. So Peter, oh, sorry, were you oh, that's not a question. Never mind. These aren't questions.
I think there's only one time for one more, I think. That Rourke one, that is a question. It just doesn't have a question mark.
Oh, let me go back to it then. Sorry, Rick, I missed it.
Just want to make sure, yeah.
It says, congrats, Luke. Very interesting results. It has been mentioned that there were between 500 and 600,000 bison. The numbers you obtained are the result of different methods, or there was a reduction of numbers. So he's asking, some people have thrown out 500 to 600,000. My range is a little bit more narrow of 350 to 400,000. So was there different methods, or was there different reduction in numbers? I'm not 100% sure how they obtained that 500 to 600,000 estimate, but I used the most recent available information from the USDA. Let me go back to that and just show you guys the information again that I used. And again, this is only an estimate and it's not a perfect guess. It could be a little bit different from this, but based on the available information, which was the USDA survey in 2017 and the Canada Agricultural Survey in 2014. And then these different databases for bison outside of North America, which are all recorded, the Australian Bison Association, which is well recorded, and then using the estimates from the Intertribal Buffalo Council. That was the compilation of this data. So I'm not sure if the other estimates maybe added extra data, or they used a different version of the USDA census maybe, but that's where that gap of 100,000 to potentially 200,000 is. Okay. Yep, that sounds good. I don't see any other questions there. So thank you all that joined me in Zoom and here in person again for seeing my research that I've worked on the last 2 years. I hope that you learned something valuable out of this and can use it on the next adventure in your life. And whenever you see bison, you can think about this research. Thank you.